Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Bryla, and I am from Sag Moraine Native Plant Community. Welcome for our special guest tonight, Elizzabeth Kaufman of Pollinator Partnership. I'm also joined here tonight by Mary Gelder of Sag Moraine Native Plant Community, and she's handling the technical things behind the scenes, and she'll be helping with the question and answer later. Before I actually get to the program, I just want to say a few words about Sag Moraine for those of you who are not familiar with our organization. We are a all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit organization in the southwest and near west suburbs of Chicago. Our mission is to promote native plants and ecological landscape practices in our suburban landscapes, whether those landscapes be residential, municipal, business, corporate, public. We want to raise awareness of the importance of restoring some native plant species back into our suburban landscapes. We had a very busy June. We had our first native plant sale, which was a huge success. We partnered with with Moraine Valley Community College. They let us use their facility to host our plant sale, and we sold close to 6,000 plants, which the huge success, our first sale, and we're just thrilled to know that there's close to 6,000 more native plants in the ground in our communities. We also did a number of, we did a community garden project, native garden project in Tinley Park and in Burbank. And then lastly, I just want to mention a few new programs, two new programs that we're starting. We're going to have a photo share program on our website. In fact, we're currently working on that. The link for that will be in the chat. What we would like you to do is send us, if you have some native plants, if you have a native plant garden on your property, even if it's not 100% native, even if you've incorporated some native plants with other plants, we'd like to have a section of our website where we show photos of this so that other people in our community can be inspired or get ideas about how they could add some native plants to their landscape, even if they're not willing to completely redo their landscape. Another new program that we're going to be starting in the next few months is our ambassador program. And what this is we're going to be offering a few training sessions to teach people how to be ambassadors for native plants. And I think after we hear Elizzabeth tonight, we're all going to see the need to try to be ambassadors for native plants in our communities. But how do you bring that subject up to people? What do you say to, if somebody gives you 5 minutes of their time, whether it be your neighbor or your sister or your friend or your mayor or your HOA or your municipality, a school, a local business, a corporation in your town, whoever it is that you have their ear, what can you say to get them thinking and get them open and get them receptive to making their property, however big it is, a little bit more of a good ecosystem to make their property provide more ecosystem service and help for our pollinators. So with that, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Elizzabeth Kaufman from Pollinator Partnership, and she will be presenting creating native habitat gardens and conservation practices at home. Elizzabeth is a senior plant ecologist with the Pollinator Partnership since 2018. Prior to that, she worked with the Chicago Botanic Gardens Plant Science Center, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. Her work at Pollinator Partnership encompasses a wide range of native pollinator habitat implementation, restoration, and enhancement projects. We're thrilled to welcome Elizzabeth Kaufman. Hi, Elizzabeth, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you, Mary, and thank you to all of you who have joined us here tonight. We really appreciate your interest and your participation. And also I'd like to say congratulations on the plant sale, native plant sale. That's wonderful. So again, we're going to talk about creating native habitat gardens and conservation practices that really make a difference at home. To start, let's see, here we go. I'd like to go over just quickly go over the agenda. So, you know, where we're going in the presentation. I'm going to start by talking about the world of pollinators and their importance to our everyday lives. And we'll talk about plant-pollinator relationships. And then we can dive into some of the more specific requirements, habitat requirements that pollinators need. And then we get to dive into the good stuff, designing pollinator gardens. We'll go step by step and talk about creating, installing, and managing gardens. And then I'll provide a few extra additional resources that are available for free download on pollinator.org, our website from Pollinator Partnership. And then we'll have time for a live question and answer session. So for those of you who are not already familiar with Pollinator Partnership, we were founded in 1997. And we were founded as a science-based nonprofit conservation organization that's dedicated exclusively to the protection of all pollinating animals. Our mission is to promote the health of pollinators, which are critical to food and ecosystems. And we do this through education, through habitat restoration, habitat enhancement, on-the-ground research, and policy input. Some of our signature initiatives include NAPSI, or the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, National Pollinator Week, which takes place every year in June. We have a program on bee-friendly farming, and a suite of programs, Monarch Wings Across America, which includes Project Wingspan, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this workshop. And here in Chicago, we've been working on a program, Project Wingspan Across Chicagoland, which has been working to amplify supply of native plants that are highly important for land managers and for restoration projects, yet are either difficult to obtain or cost prohibitive for most restoration efforts. And so with that, when we talk about the world of pollinators and pollinator conservation, we're not just talking about bees and butterflies. We are talking about a really highly diverse group of species. And this includes birds such as hummingbirds, who are primary migratory in North America, and those which are a little more elusive, such as the endangered honeycreeper, which is endemic to Hawaii. Pollinating species also include mammals, such as bats, and lesser known species, such as the honey possum and black and white ruffled lemurs. There are also several reptiles who provide pollination services, such as geckos and lizards, and of course, the multitude of insects, which includes bees and butterflies, as well as moths, beetles, flies, wasps, and ants. Together, this highly diverse group of species equates to over 200,000 known pollinator species worldwide. And then of all pollinating species, bees are really the most proficient at performing pollination services. Worldwide, there's over 20,000 species of bees. And bees, which have co-evolved with plants over millennia, have provided a primary means of reproduction, and therefore have helped to shape the incredible diversity of plant species that we find around the globe today. Here in North America, there are over 4,000 unique native bee species. And this diverse group ranges in body size, in their foraging ability, and in their range, as well as in social behavior. Bees rely on different floral resources, and they also require different nesting and overwintering habitats, which we'll talk about more later in the presentation. But for example, small solitary bees may only travel up to 300 feet from their nest site to foraging habitat areas, while honeybees can forage up to 2 miles from their home. And there are some larger bumblebees that have foraging ranges that are up to 8 miles. So bumblebees and honeybees are social and they live in colonies. They live in nests or hives. However, the majority of bees live solitary lifestyles. They nest in hollow-stemmed vegetation, in undisturbed soil, and underneath leaf litter and thatch. Lepidoptera, which includes butterflies and moths, are also one of the most highly diverse groups of organisms known on Earth. Worldwide, there's over 160,000 known species. And here in North America, there are over 14,300 identified species. Butterflies and pollinated moths rely on specific host plants for reproduction. And while some species, very few species, can reproduce on a number of different types of plants, for example, the red-spotted purple can reproduce on willows and on birches, as well as hawthorns, and serviceberries, and native cherries, most Lepidoptera have evolved really highly specialized reproductive relationships with selective plant species. For example, there's the zebra swallowtail that reproduces on pawpaw trees, and the meadow fritillary that reproduces on violets. And as most of you are familiar, monarchs that reproduce only on milkweed species. So pollinators are really highly important to both global and local biodiversity. They truly are the glue that holds the natural world together, and they allow it to function as we know it. Animal pollinators provide ecosystem services that are vital to planetary health and to ecosystem integrity, as well as resilience. Worldwide, 85 to 90% of all flowering plants either depend on or are enhanced by animal pollination for successful reproduction and for genetic diversity. That equates to somewhere between 350 to 400,000 plant species worldwide. And with that number in mind, we really can begin to connect and grow our appreciation for plant pollinator relationships and understand the interdependency with vital ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration, climate regulation, erosion control, and nutrient cycling. The pollinators also serve as the foundation for food chains. They provide food for wildlife, be that through increased fruit and seed set, or as in the case of insect pollinators, they may be the main course. For example, 96% of birds eat insects, and 60% of bird species completely rely on insects for their diet. One clutch of chickadees can consume 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars during their rearing alone. Bats, for example, eat between 6,000 and 8,000 insects a night. And amphibians and megafauna, such as bears, also rely on insects as a primary food source. And as E.O. Wilson wisely said, life without insects, including insect pollinators, would be a life absent of higher forms of life. So pollinators also perform services that are truly invaluable to us and to the world and US economy, as well as to our health. 75% of crop species worldwide require animal pollination. And in fact, 1 out of 3 bites of food is attributed to these animal pollination services. As depicted in the images here are choices for fruits, for vegetables and nuts, and for staples such as coffee, and chocolate, and oils, as well as the celebratory margarita, which is made with tequila, thanks to bats pollinating agaves, would all be drastically reduced, if not absent, without pollination services. Pollinators contribute over $29 billion to the US agricultural economy, and they're estimated to contribute somewhere between $220 and $577 billion to the global economy. In addition to the direct foods that they provide, they contribute to the production of raw materials such as hardwoods and dyes. However, as you are all well aware, I'm sure, these all-important species are in trouble, and the cascading impacts, including those to our food supply and our economy, to wildlife and to biodiversity, to ecosystem function, and to climate regulation, are almost immeasurable. And without concerted conservation efforts, these far-reaching effects from these losses could really be catastrophic, both here in the United States, as well as across the globe. There are multiple factors that have contributed to the decline of pollinators and other wildlife populations. And the interacting or synergistic effects from habitat loss, urbanization, monocrop agricultural practices, disease, parasites, and pesticides misuse have obviously proven to be detrimental. However, what we're primarily focused on here today is the loss of natural habitat and what each of us can do to support pollinator conservation. So what can we do that will truly have a positive effect and make a real difference? We can create habitat. We can provide habitat and provide the resources and the habitat needs, especially in the places where it's most absent. And that includes urban and suburban, as well as agricultural areas, which have basically become pollen deserts. And while some people might question how much good, can a backyard habitat garden or can balcony pots provide, these smaller patches and these resources will truly provide vital nectar and pollen resources in areas that are otherwise pollen deserts. And this will make a difference in the conservation of these vital species, as well as for other wildlife species such as songbirds. These same patches also provide essential stepping stone habitat and act as a bridge connecting larger natural habitat areas. That ultimately will promote species survival. So to better understand what resources and elements are needed to design and create conservation habitat gardens that will support diverse pollinating species, excuse my dog in the background, let's take a closer look at habitat requirements and plant-pollinator relationships. So flowering plants are the most diverse phylum on Earth after insects. They exhibit an astonishing diverse array of growth form, and they produce displays that are more diverse in size, shape, color, fragrance, and arrangement than most of us can imagine. The correlation between pollinators and flower characteristics is one of the greatest examples of coevolution. And these relationships over time have not only produced diverse flowering plant species, but a plethora of pollinating species. They all exhibit different physical characteristics and therefore require different habitat characteristics and resources for survival. The majority of flower visiting insects are generalists, which means that many pollinating species in some genera, such as bumblebees or bombus, can successfully meet their needs for pollen and nectar by foraging on numerous different plant species across multiple plant genera. However, some pollinators have highly evolved specialized relationships with a single plant genus to a few genera, and even with individual plant species. The same is true for plants when considering their reproductive needs. For example, the federally threatened Eastern Fringe Prairie Orchid, which does grow here in Illinois in the Chicago region, is only pollinated by night flying hawk moths. Many Lepidoptera, or again, butterfly and moth species, have evolved very highly specific relationships with host plants. An example of that would be the Carner blue butterfly that is dependent on a single species for reproduction, which is wild lupin, and the monarch that is an obligate to the genus Asclepias or milkweed. Having a knowledge of these obligate relationships, those between plants and pollinators, can serve as a really important guide for plant material selection. And growing your awareness for the wildlife species that have a historic range within your home site or project area will greatly increase your knowledge for selecting the appropriate plant species in your specific region. Another example is the rusty patch bumblebee, which Catherine and I were talking about just before we started the program. If you would like more information on specific species of concern that are within our region, I would recommend going to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services website, which is www.fws.gov, and then /program/endangered species. And they provide not only a list of endangered species, including insects and animals, but they also provide lists of plants that are specific to supporting those species. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Here we go. Okay. So plant pollinator relationships are primarily symbiotic. That means they work together and they help each other out. As pollinators move from plant to plant to gather pollen and nectar, they will incidentally move pollen from a plant's male reproductive structure to another plant's female reproductive structure. And that activity increases fruit and seed set, even for species that can self-pollinate, for example, strawberries. If you've ever had a strawberry that didn't taste quite rich and sweet, it may have been self-pollinated in comparison to those that have fuller taste, which were most likely pollinated by insects. So of all pollinators, again, native bees and honeybees are the most proficient and important in providing reliable pollination services. And that's because they have specialized hair-like structures, which they gather pollen with, and they actively collect this pollen for their young. While they're collecting pollen, they disperse in small amounts as they move from plant to plant. Other pollinators, such as butterflies and moths, are foraging for nectar, and they more so incidentally brush into and carry smaller amounts of pollen as they migrate. And even though Lepidoptera are less efficient pollinators than bees, they still do play a really important role in the world of pollination. And again, some plant species rely entirely on them for their reproduction. So let's dive a little bit into more some of the specific details in terms of habitat requirements, both for native bees and for butterflies and moths. When we want to support native bees, we need to provide habitat components throughout all their life stages. So that includes nesting habitat for depositing eggs, as well as for larval development and overwintering. To support bees, we need to provide diverse floral resources for different foraging needs and preferences, as well as abilities. This means providing different floral morphologies, or again, the flower sizes, shapes, and colors for different sized bees, from the small, tiny bees to the larger bumblebees. And we also want to provide species that will provide diverse phenological bloom times, which means they are, you have blooms that are available. So there's nectar and pollen resources that are available from early spring through the summer and all the way through late fall. Again, the majority of bees are solitary. They nest and they overwinter in cavities under bare soil, in woody debris, or in pithy stems, such as those that you'll find in like raspberries or elderberries, sumac, goldenrods as well. They also will nest in hollow stem bunch grasses and under leaf litter, which is a good time to bring up the importance of postponing the fall cleanups, the landscape fall cleanup, and leave the leaves over winter until the following spring when temperatures have warmed, and the insects that have had the opportunity to hatch. Bumblebees are social bees like European honeybees. For those that aren't already aware, honeybees are not native to the United States, but again, very important for pollination services. And bumblebees, they build nests in old rodent burrows, in rock walls, as well as in cavities of dead wood, under compost piles, and again, in bunch grasses. Lepidoptera, which includes both butterflies and pollinating moths, require host plants for part of their reproductive cycle. When we talk about obligate relationships between specific host plants or plant genera and butterflies, again, one of the better known obligate relationships is between the monarch butterfly and milkweed species. Another example is the Conner blue butterfly and wild lupin. There are over, one note about milkweeds and monarchs. There are over 70 native milkweed species in the United States, but that includes those that are rare, threatened, and endangered. When it comes time for plant material selection, it's really important that you install the species that are native to your region. So here in the Chicago region, there's common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, world milkweed, there's green milkweed, tall milkweed, and swamp milkweed, for example. If we take a look at another species, swallowtails, we can gain an appreciation for both specialized and more generalized relationships. So for example, the spicebush swallowtail, it reproduces on the spicebush shrub and the sassafras tree. Zebra swallowtails reproduce with pawpaw trees, and the eastern tiger swallowtails reproduce on tulip trees, as well as on wild black cherries and ash species. And then black swallowtails can successfully reproduce on many different species in the parsley family, including parsley, dill, fennel, carrot, golden Alexanders, and common rue. It's always nice to include in your gardens is to include a little herb section for swallowtail reproduction. Many Lepidoptera species also need undisturbed woody debris and leaf litter for overwintering habitat. And some species, chrysalis or cocoons, look like dried leaves, as shown in the images on the slide in the top right and lower center. So again, it is vital to leave the leaves over the winter months and into the spring until after temperatures have warmed. And Lepidoptera, as well as native bees, have emerged. Okay, so now we're going to get into designing garden sites. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of plant material selection and so forth, I wanted to take a little time to talk about the measures of biodiversity. This can be important both for smaller gardens, but most definitely applies to restoring larger areas. But again, when we can take lessons home from restoration practices on larger natural areas and incorporate those into our own gardens at home. So the primary goal of ecological restoration is to support the restoration of biologically diverse, self-sustaining communities. And when we talk about restoring biodiversity, we're talking about restoring more than just individual species, but also about attempting to restore the components that together serve as the foundation for intricate networks and ecological processes that can function as productive and resilient ecosystems. So how do we begin to approach such complex undertakings? I always like to nod to John Steinbeck. We look from the micro to the macro and back again. So we're going to jump into some of the micro here before looking at the overall picture. So consideration for each of the measures of biodiversity are vital to the long-term success of restoration efforts. And as we approach plant material selection for pollinator and habitat conservation, we want to include considerations beyond just plant species diversity. So when we talk about genetic diversity within individual species, we're talking about the functions within plant species that can vary genetically from adaptations that have evolved over time in response to varying environmental and climate conditions. Through that process, there's a result in local ecotypes, which is a subset of plants within the same species that have adapted to conditions that are associated with different geographic regions. So for example, plants here in our region have adapted to our local climate conditions. It is better to source plant materials that are from original plant source that are from the Chicago region, rather than sourcing, so if you talk about bee balm or Monarda, sourcing that from Tennessee, which those plants and those genetics would have adapted to the weather, climate conditions, and soils in Tennessee versus Chicago. So we also want to look at maximizing genetic diversity because it increases the potential for adaptation to future conditions and long-term survival. Like with all organisms, plant populations can suffer across time if they don't have genetic diversity. The same is true when populations become very isolated or if introduced plant materials have low genetic diversity. That can make them become susceptible to threats such as inbreeding depression, and it increases the chances for a weakened population. Genetic diversity really provides plasticity, which is the ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So 2 points with that. One is if your restoration site or your garden site is close or adjacent to a sensitive area, such as a remnant habitat area or an area of conservation, you want to be very conscious to try and source materials that are within a reasonable distance from your home garden site. At the same time, we don't want to, as I gave an example before, we don't want to try to increase genetic diversity by sourcing plant materials from a great distance from home. So again, we want to avoid sourcing from Tennessee or from Colorado, and we want to try and keep our the source of our materials within the specific definitions can range from 50 miles to 150 miles, depending on the sensitivity of species. When we start to talk about like species richness and species diversity, we're talking about this distinct number of species present in an area. That's species richness, the distinct number of distinct different species. And we talk about species diversity, we're talking about the number of different species in relation to the relative abundance of all species present. So to try and simplify that, if we're examining a group of 30 individual plants and we've identified 3 distinct species, the measure of 3 is the expression of species richness in the group. I don't want to spend too much time diving into the specifics here. However, I just want to emphasize the point that I believe would most applies to most of us that are here today, that when we're selecting plant materials, it's really important to include a high number of diverse plant species and life forms, meaning wildflowers, grasses, sedges or carex, shrubs and trees, which will help provide and meet the needs of diverse pollinators and other wildlife. So, and on that note, in continuation, we want to talk about structural diversity. So structural diversity in some ways could be a reflection of species diversity, but with the additional intention to provide diverse plant life forms. So a diverse plant community is going to provide specialized habitats and microhabitats that pollinators and other wildlife need to survive. For example, flowering shrubs and trees provide some of the earliest floral resources that are available to pollinators, while hollow stem bunch grasses are going to provide overwintering habitat for bees and other insects. Many native sedge, shrub, and tree species are also host plants for native butterflies and moth reproduction. The importance of including diverse plant life forms can be summarized with the understanding that the greater the structural diversity restored, the greater number of insects and wildlife species will be sustained. So that's sort of that layering effect. Functional diversity. So functional diversity is really a complex measurement, but in short, is reflective of niche and ecosystem service provision. It represents the exchanges that occur between and among plant communities, pollinators, and other wildlife. In recognizing either the presence or absence of niche fulfillment within a plant community can be critical to the long-term success of restoration efforts. And that this mostly applies to larger project areas, but you can mimic that and bring that home. However, so if you include measures for ensuring that there is appropriate genetic diversity within the species, meaning you're sourcing from local sources, and measures for species richness and diversity among your species, and applying including measures for providing structural diversity. Again, you're talking about native grasses and grass-like species like the carex and the sedges, providing wildflowers, both annuals and perennials, and species that bloom across all the seasons, as well as providing flowering shrubs and trees. You will have provided the foundation for ongoing functional diversity that will attract and support many, many diverse wildlife, as well as pollinating species. All right, now we get to dive into plant material selection. I know there's a lot of text on the slide. I will try to illustrate a little bit as we go along. I could use a few more photos of beautiful flowers and pollinators, but when we're designing and we're selecting materials for habitat gardens, we want to try and consider the resource requirements for a diverse array of species. And we're thinking from small to large. And we also want to include any specific resources to support the conservation of at-risk species. The Carner blue butterflies, we're here in Chicago, we're a little far out of its current range. But monarchs and rusty patch bumblebees are true species of concern. Really, the rusty patch has a federal listing status as endangered, and the monarch is currently under consideration for threatened or endangered status by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we really want to try and provide with the floral and reproductive and nesting resources that those species require. The plant species that you include in your gardens, that we include in our gardens, should provide diverse phenological bloom times, meaning that, again, floral resources are available across all seasons. So starting in early spring, which primarily are provided by shrubs and trees, through the summer and late into the fall. In addition, we want to provide plants that will provide overwintering habitat, such as hollow stem bunch grasses. We want to strive to include annual, biannual, and perennial forbs that, again, are going to provide different resources in diverse colors, sizes, and shapes that will therefore provide resources for different foraging abilities, for different behaviors, and for the size of different pollinating species, as well as other beneficial insects. For example, hummingbirds, bumblebees, and long-tongued bees You want to include plant species that have deep-throated or tubular and spurred flowers, such as Aquilegia or Columbine, Monarda or Bee Balm, Lobelia, and Penstemon species, as well as some shorter tubed or shallow cupped and open-facing flowers, such as asters and cone flowers, and goldenrods, which provide easy access to pollen and nectar. Again, installing flowering trees and shrubs such as willows or salix, the dogwoods, which are cornus species, amalanthus, which are service berries, New Jersey tea, witch hazel, magnolias, and buttonbush, among many, many others. Installing those along the perimeters of your gardens or as hedgerows or interspersed as sheltered islands will not only provide vital resources in the early spring months, but they'll also serve as windbreaks, which assist pollinators' foraging activities. And I believe you all heard a presentation by Doug Calamy. Again, as Doug often shares, oak trees in particular are known to support more insect diversity than any other genus. So including some oaks in your plantings, if you have a larger area, is always a very beneficial way to support conservation of many species, I should say, the conservation of many species. So when we talk about non-native plants and cultivars, also known as nativars, we want to maybe understand why we don't want to include many nativars and cultivars. Cultivars and non-native plants, they support less native insects, therefore you'll have reduced insect diversity. That's with less insects, there'll be less insectivores, meaning there'll be less birds because their food source is gone. You won't be supporting specialist pollinators. And this can really impact local diversity as well as the interaction diversity. Again, the relationship between plants and pollinators. Altogether, that compromises ecosystem function, and it's going to have a true impact on complex food webs. So true natives are always better. There's nothing wrong with including, a few specimen trees, or maybe somebody really likes cosmos, including some of that in your garden. But in addition, and primarily, we want to incorporate true natives in our plantings. So site preparation. I'm jumping right to site preparation. I should back up and talk quickly about site selection. I think many of you are probably already very familiar with site selection, and that understanding that if you choose a site that is primarily shaded, you'll have to then choose and plant plants that are specialized for shaded areas. For most pollinator supporting plants, you're going to look for an area that gets 6 or more hours of sun, so that you can fulfill their growth needs and requirements. The most important step to successfully installing a habitat garden is site preparation. Site preparation is eliminating the unwanted vegetation, which is going to pose competition for those plants that you're trying to encourage and establish. It is, well worth the time and the effort that it takes to fully prepare a site before you invest in native plant materials, which, again, as I'm sure many of you are aware of and have experienced, they have a hefty price tag, and you want to, again, prepare your site as best you can for that investment so that it can be as successful as possible. Not to mention, you don't want to be chasing after weeds for years to come. So to prepare a site, there are options. One option is herbicide, when used responsibly and according to label, it is a really good tool for restoration. And it's really, it's one of the only tools that you can use when you are restoring a very large site. When you're working on smaller sites and gardens, you can use solarization and smothering. And we'll go into some details about each of those that can be done successfully at home. So when we talk about solarization, there are a few steps. It takes some time, but it's highly successful in removing unwanted vegetation. You're going to start with watering the site down well, and then you're going to cover it with a clear plastic, and you're going to put weights on that plastic. You can use dirt from the site, you can use rocks, longer boards, because you really want to hold that plastic down tight to the ground. The idea is you're creating a greenhouse. You want to heat the soil and the vegetation to a really high temperature. So again, solarization should be done in the summer. Depending on the year, that may happen in, starting in mid-June. For example, like this year where we had such a late start to summer, temperatures got warm enough, let's say in mid-June, and you're gonna water, then cover it with the plastic, weight it down, and then you're gonna leave it for about 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, you can pull the plastic back and you're gonna water it again. And you're gonna leave that for about 2 weeks. And what you're trying to do by removing the plastic and watering it is encourage any other weed seeds or grass seeds or rhizomatous plants to start to grow again. And after that 2 weeks of growth, you're gonna cover it again with the plastic, weight it all down so you have a nice tight seal, and you're gonna leave it for 3 weeks. And then you're gonna continue that cycle until there's very little or no regrowth back. The similar technique is smothering. So you can use cardboard in the same pattern cycle as solarization, or you can also leave the cardboard in place. In areas that have really high weed pressure, again, we'll say Tennessee, for example, it's a really great technique to keeping the weeds at bay. You would lay your cardboard and then cover it with the mulch, or you can lay cardboard and remove it altogether. On that note, wood mulch is not good for perennial plants. It's fine to use around shrubs and other woody species as long as you leave a few inches from the base of the stem of the tree or shrub out so that it can breathe and it can get water. For perennials, you want to use a lighter mulch, which is a leaf mulch, if you're going to include mulch. Again, for smaller sites with less weed pressure, you can remove the vegetation by hand, and then you can cover the area with cardboard, which then will act as a barrier, and then place soil on top of it and plant directly into it. Another technique, again, to backstep slightly, is if you are in a high pressure weed area, if you cover your garden site with cardboard, you can cut holes in it and then plant the plants directly into those holes, and the remaining cardboard will act as a weed barrier. Okay, garden design. Okay, so this is where it gets exciting and a little more colorful. Again, we want to select plants that are appropriate for our region, plants that are native to the area, the Chicago region. And we want to select the plants that are appropriate for our site conditions. So for example, here in Illinois, we have a lot of primarily mesic soils that stay moist most of the time, but there are also areas that are really heavy clay soils and those that are sandy and rocky. So you want to make sure you've taken a look at your soil and you've examined it. You don't really need to do a soil test, a soil analysis, but become familiar with the texture of your soil. And if you know you have really heavy clay soils, you're going to want to choose species that can thrive in those heavier clay soils. And if you have drier soils, the same would hold true. You choose plants that do well in these drier soils. Again, local genotype, you want to try and source plants from as close to your site, your home site, as possible. If you need to source outside, let's say you want a particular species and you can't find any at local plant nurseries in the immediate region, there's more flexibility for sourcing across a longitudinal gradient than across latitude, meaning you can bring plants more easily in from the east or west than you can from the north or the south. And if you were going to cross latitudes, I would encourage bringing plants from the south or the north rather than from the north to the south because of these, we'll call it climate fluctuations and warming temperatures. Again, the more local source plant materials you use, the higher probability of success in establishment and long-term survival you're going to have, because the genetics that are needed to survive, even through the fluctuations, are within the plant species from the immediate area. And when you choose plants, your blooming species, you want to try and create your gardens. You want to include at least 3 to 5 blooming species per season, as well as plants that are going to get you from season to season. And when I talk about seasons, if we talk about spring, if we talk about April, May, and let's say the first 2 weeks of June, we talk about summer blooming plants, the last 2 weeks of June, July, and August. And then for fall, September, October, and November. Again, this is important because we want to provide consistent resources for pollinators throughout all time. Things are changing in terms of phenology, meaning the time both for pollinators being around and for plants blooming because of climate fluctuations. So the more diversity that we can include in our gardens, the more safeguarding we're doing in terms of being able to provide a conservation area and have your garden be a conservation support. When we talk about monarch conservation and support, you want to try and provide 2 or more milkweed species in your gardens. And that is because monarchs also agree that diversity is the spice of life. Research has shown that female monarchs are more likely to lay eggs or oviposit when there's a diversity of milkweed available to them. And here in the Chicago region, there are many different types of milkweed that you can include and in your gardens, from purple milkweed to tall green milkweed, swamp milkweed, butterfly milkweed, common milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed, world milkweed, many milkweeds here that are available through native plant vendors, which is wonderful. It's really wonderful. Again, we want to try and provide structural diversity. So when possible, you want to install flowering shrubs and trees along or near the perimeter of your garden. And again, the greater the structural diversity, the greater number of pollinating and other wildlife species you'll be supporting. When it comes time for arranging your plants, you want to try and plant groups of the same species together, because pollinators are attracted to blocks of color within plantings. So if you think about like the searchlight at night, these large, colorful, solid floral displays will act like that searchlight at night and call the pollinators in, plant it, and they will come, right? Grouping resources together like this, it also helps support their foraging efficiency, and it's easier for the pollinators to go from flower to flower that are grouped closer together rather than having to fly longer, further distances between different blooming species. You want to try and limit tall and competitive grasses because grass species will quickly outcompete wildflowers. So keep the grasses in check, but again, grasses and carex or sedges are really important for the overall structural diversity, and they also act as a glue that will hold, you know, your garden site together and allow it to function and continue and have longevity. You also want to maintain some undisturbed nesting sites. So again, this can include patches of bare or sparsely vegetated soils. You could include some fallen woody debris, or some, you know, some hollow-stemmed shrubs. Sumac is a great example. Goldenrods, Joe Pye weed is another really good one. At the end of the year, in the fall, again, we want to leave the leaves, we want to leave the structural, the structures that are standing. And then when it comes time for spring, after the temperatures have warmed and you're cleaning up your garden area, leave a few of the old stems, because those again will act as nesting sites and provide habitat for bees. You can also create a safe watering station by filling a shallow dish or bowl with stones or marbles are really pretty. And that'll provide safe landing spots for your thirsty visitors. Okay, planting. All right. It's always a good idea to lay out and arrange your plants before you start digging your holes. And that's because most of us like to, you know, we're a little finicky, and even though we're creating a conservation garden and we want to provide these resources for our pollinators, we also want it to be aesthetically pleasing for our eye. And we want to allow enough space between the plants for them to fully mature without them becoming overly crowded. If you plant in odd numbers, such as 3s, 5s, 7s, 11s, that is really highly appealing for the human eye and aesthetic. It's one of those rules to landscape design, professional landscape design, that you can take home and incorporate in your own yard or garden, and you'll find it very pleasing, as well as your neighbors will find it pleasing as well. When you're transplanting plugs and plants, you want to always try to dig your holes wider and deeper than the plant roots. And then when you pull your plants out of the pot, you want to gently loosen the roots and then install the plants. You want to install only to the depth of the crown so the plants can breathe. And that's where the roots, the top of the roots meet the stem. And basically to where the plants are the same soil level that the plants are in the pot, that's where you want to plant them in your garden, not deeper and not higher. If your soils are dry, pre-watering your holes before you put your plants in is a great technique. It really helps ensure that all the plant roots stay moist, and it helps them establish and settle in very nicely. Once you've planted your plants and covered the hole with soil, you want to thoroughly water it in, and you want to be sure to keep it moist for at least 2 to 3 weeks, and then water as needed. The goal is to keep the soil approximately like 2 inches below the surface moist at all times. So if you're wondering, is it time to water or not, just dig your finger into the soil just a little ways and see if it's moist under the surface. And then you want to just monitor and be patient as the plants become fully established. So site management. We want to talk a little bit about monitoring for weeds, especially in the beginning. Over time, there'll be less weeding that's required. Early on, when there's more space for weeds, more weeds will come. I don't know how they do it, but they always know when there's fresh disturbed soil or when there's open space, the weed seeds find their way in, either from blowing in or they come up from the seed bank below. Hand weeding can be a really wonderful tool for decompression and can be a really nice meditation. And it'll also give you the time to not only to relax, but also to get to know your garden space and to know if you're providing this continual bloom and these continual resources across all growing seasons, or to be able to identify any times when there are not resources, which you can then add over time. Again, the weed pressures are going to decrease over time while your natives fill in. There's a saying, sleep, creep, and leap. That's in reference to prairie reestablishment. The first year they talk about things sort of sleeping. You really only have color and blooms from your annuals, and maybe from some annuals, black-eyed Susans are going to show up the first year. The second year, things are sort of creeping along and you're starting to see a few more blooms and other species. Again, this is primarily from seed, but the same holds true for some plug plants. Some things they'll be starting to show their colors and get some blooms. But by the third and fourth year, things are really going to leap. Especially when it comes to perennials, they're really going to start to exhibit their full, spectacular array of color and size, and things will really fill in. Again, the more your natives have filled in, the less weeds you have to deal with, which is very joyful. If you're in a really high weed pressure area where you have weeds encroaching in, you can very carefully spot spray individual species if you're open to using spray, whether that be a chemical herbicide, or you can use a mixture of white vinegar and salt. Nothing can live in white vinegar and salt. So you want to be very careful when you're applying, whether it be the home remedy or some chemical product. And if you're using a sprayer, you can put like a funnel over the tip of a wand or a spray bottle so that you can direct whatever you're using right down onto the specific plant that you're trying to eliminate. And you want to remember also that over time, you can always continue to add diversity, and you can enlarge your gardens by planting additional species or growing the space that you have, again, over time. That's a very common practice in restoration. We can all only take on as much as we can take on each year, and it is a bit of work and a bit of commitment. So starting small and growing over time is a great way to approach creating habitat and habitat gardens. And I have to say again, because it can't be said too much, you want to leave the leaves and the debris in the fall and postpone that fall cleanup, postpone your spring cleanup until after the temperatures have warmed. And once they've warmed, you want about, it's approximately 5 days or so of warm temperatures in the 50s will be warm enough to have allowed pollinators to emerge from their winter's den. And then one other note about when we're talking about monarchs and pests is to talk about insect pests. So milkweed aphids, which everyone can very easily recognize because they are bright orange, can be somewhat of a nuisance. It's best to try and remove those by hand by just sliding your hand up and over the milkweed and squashing them by hand. If that's offensive to anyone, you can use a homemade wash using soap, oil, and again, a little vinegar. But you want to remember that if you do use any sort of solution on the milkweed aphids, you want to wash it off after just a few minutes, because those the things that will work on the milkweed aphids will also repel or kill monarch butterflies or monarch caterpillars, I should say, the monarch caterpillars and their eggs. So we want to be careful with that. But removing those aphids is not a bad idea, as the ants that are tending the aphids will also pick off monarch eggs if they encounter them on the milkweed. Okay, so resources. Through the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, which is, again, one of Pollinator Partnership's signature initiative, we've produced these native pollinator cards. They have really easy to follow step-by-step guidelines for installing gardens, and they include recommendations for 18 different native species here in the Midwest. There's also cards for Alaska and the Northeast, the Northwest, Intermountain West, Great Plains, the Texas region, and there are cards coming too for California. But all the species that were recommended on these cards have been vetted by a number of plant authorities, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, through Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, the National Park Service, Pollinator Partnership, and other botanical experts have all weighed in on these plant choices that have been suggested. You know, they're good vetted plant choices and suggestions. I'd also like to let you know that there are other downloadable materials that are available to you. There are eco-regional guides at pollinator.org, as well as guides on installing and creating habitat. Again, all these resources are free and available for you to use. And with that, I'd like to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're back. All righty, so we do have a few questions here for you, Elizabeth, and that was terrific.
Thank you.
You mentioned the to stay away from some of the larger grasses, but yet grasses are very important for our pollinators.
Yes.
Are there any grasses that you do recommend for smaller landscapes?
Sure. Little blue stem is one of my favorites. And it is also, it's seen as a somewhat ornamental plant, but it's compact in comparison to like big blue stem, which can take over a small garden area.
Okay.
There's also northern sea oats is a really beautiful plant. Among others, like I've got a botanical name, Spirabolus. It's another good plant. Sometimes I mix up the common name and the botanical name. We're not mixed up, but I had no one or the other. But there are a number of smaller compact grasses, and depending on what a native plant supplier carries, those would be available. But little blue stem is a really important grass for our area.
Okay.
In terms of the resources that it provides, and it supports other semi-parasitic plants as well. Some really wonderful wildflowers.
Wonderful, little blue stem. Okay. Mary?
So Jim would like to know to provide more habitat for native and solitary bees in my pollinator garden. I wish to upcycle last season's mammoth sunflower stems that are cut into 6-inch segments and then bundled together. To keep those bundles dry throughout the summer and fall, what do you recommend that I use to contain or wrap those stems so that they do not spawn molds and other fungi which might harm the bees?
Right, that's a really good question. So when we create these artificial bee houses and which is really wonderful to provide, you do want to keep your eye on it, and it is recommended to clean them out every year, being careful for any nesting bees that may be in there. But I've used, like, there's a larger size, like the 5-inch, 6-inch PVC tubing that you can get, and you can have sections cut off, and then there's end caps that you can use that fit the PVC tubing. That works. Cans work as well. A wood box or frame can also work. You just want to, when you do create the house, you want to stick it up like under the eave of a house or someplace where it's sheltered, so it's out of the direct rain and out of the direct weather. That'll also help keep it dry and from molding. But yeah, do your due diligence and check that out every spring. And if you find moldy parts, remove those and replace them with new stems.
Wonderful. Janine asks, can we start our gardens from seedlings in containers?
Yes, that's a great way. That is one of the most wonderful and successful ways I have seen many people grow milkweed, for example. Most native plant species, especially the perennial species, need to go through cold stratification or cold moist stratification. So a really neat trick is to take like an old water bottle or gallon size, like the milk container. You can cut the top off about 3/4 the way off up, fill it with dirt, put your seeds in, cover them appropriately. Milkweeds like to be a little bit deeper than some of the other smaller seeded plants. Water it and then put that top back on and duct tape it. But you leave the top, the bottle cap off so it can breathe. And then you can just stick it on the side of your house and it will go through the cold and warming fluctuations over winter. And then it's also, the bottle cap is open so it can breathe, but it also can be rained or snowed on. And come spring, you should have nice sprouting species.
Now, how about, I'm just going to add to this, what about people who don't want to do that? How successful do you see people with trying to seed direct sow into the ground in the fall?
That's a great question too. So potentially better than fall. You can seed in the fall, but I most highly recommend doing a frost seeding, which is so you wait until after the first winter snow. So you're waiting until at this point in Chicago, we're talking December, right? You wait till there's some snow, and it's especially beneficial if you know there's more snow in the forecast. But you throw your seed, you can broadcast it out on top of the snow. Then you can see how well you have covered your area and how evenly you're distributing the seed. And then perfect if you get this blanket of snow on top. But then over time, it'll go through that cold stratification. And as the snow and the ice melt, come spring, the seed will work its way gently right into where it needs to go into the soil. So like the two most important things with seeding is you need good seed to soil contact, but you also need to make sure your seed isn't buried too deep. And anything deeper than about 1/4 of an inch is too deep for most native species. They like to be right up only about 1/8 of an inch from the top of the soil surface.
I like that. It makes our garden season longer too, because we can be out there gardening in the snow.
That's right. Absolutely.
Elizabeth, you mentioned early on that you were going to talk about the Project Wingspan.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. So Project Wingspan has gone through a number of reiterations, focusing on different land use types and sectors. Right now, we're working on Project Wingspan across agricultural lands. All the programs are really wonderful in that they work with volunteers, and we work across multiple states. There's a free training online that goes over plant identification and seed collection techniques. And then when you sign up for that training, you're connected to a state coordinator who will connect you with a team of other volunteers. And the teams go out and collect seeds, native seeds from a target list of plants. All the seed is then sent to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, where we have a native plant horticulturist, and she's charged with keeping all the collections separate from one another. For example, in Illinois, there are 3 separate collection and redistribution regions. I'll get to redistribution in a moment. So she takes the seed, keeping all the collections separate by region. She cleans all the seed, and then a portion of the seed is grown into live plug plants, and a portion remains a seed. And then all of the plant materials are sent out for free to various sites, different project sites, restoration sites, home sites, to provide materials to increase habitat and floral resources for pollinators. The focus for these programs is on the monarch butterfly and rusty patch bumblebee. So all the plants that are on that target list are especially good resources for those. And it's a really wonderful program because you're meeting other like-minded people. You're doing this outdoor activity, which is safe, which is important in these times. And you're doing a lot of great good. And then the knowledge you get from the program for plant identification and seed collection, and you also learn about, the seed cleaning a little bit and seed storage, then you can use for yourself and in future endeavors. And if folks have an interest in that, I believe you have the link that's been shared in the chat box.
We sure do.
Yes, we did. I did put that in there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are suburban landscapes. So I just want to ask, you because I really want to make it easy as possible for people to add native plants to their landscapes to help native pollinator plants. So I know it's good to plant in quantity, but I also know it's good to plant a diverse amount. So if you're talking about small yards with limited space, what is the best to go for? And if they only have room for a little bit, do you have some like suggestions for a few plants that pack the most punch?
Gotcha. That is a really good question. I would say the most important thing, the highest goal is to provide blooms across all seasons from spring to fall. And really, while you want to aim for at least, they say 3 to 5 blooming species per season. If you have a small area, you might be looking at 3 species, let's say 3 species per growing season. The native pollinator garden cards that I talked about at the end of the presentation give really good suggestions. There's a list of 9 species, so 3 spring, summer, fall under one column, and then alternatives 3 spring, summer, fall, so that you can provide continuous blooms. Most of the species that are on those cards are smaller, and it's intended for smaller garden sizes. It's intended for someone who only has 3 by 6 feet or 6 by 9 feet.
Perfect.
Smaller space.
And everyone can find those on your website, pollinator.org. And is it under a resources tab or?
It's under resources, and it says garden cards. It's right at the top. Resources.
Wonderful.
Garden cards. Yeah.
Can native plants be transplanted after they've started growing? And what if we need to change the layout or location?
They can. I would say the best time for transplanting is early spring or in the early fall. And when I say fall, you're aiming for about September. You want to transplant before, so the plants have enough time to grow into the new soil a little bit, so that the roots can grow into the new soil before the winter freeze comes. And that's absolutely acceptable. The time that is the worst, I would say, for transplanting plants is while they're flowering. You can transplant while they're flowering, but know that you'll lose the flowers, at least for that year. They should come back the next year, but just be sure to keep them really well watered, because it's like starting over with a young plant. And until their roots have grown into the new soil where you're moving them to, they'll be dependent upon you for supplemental water to keep their roots moist.
Great information. Are non-organic fertilizers harmful to pollinators?
That is another really good question. It's a somewhat complex question, in that it depends on what you're talking about. I'll use Miracle
Nobody's
Grow.
using Miracle Grow
Miracle Grow.
outside, or even
Right,
potty
outside.
mix with Miracle Grow. Does that
It's, that's, we can do what we can do. And in terms of how that is transferred from plant to pollen or nectar and then to pollinating species or wildlife, again, that it depends on the very specific compound. I use Miracle Grow on my indoor plants only, my indoor house plants. I will use Miracle Grow. Outdoors, I don't. The thing is for native plants, they don't really need fertilizer. That's the beautiful thing about using native plants, is they are adapted to our soil conditions. So they should thrive on what you have just there in the ground. Again, you want to, take a look at your soil and look at the texture and the consistency. If you feel like, it feels really heavy and kind of like clay, there are species that will do better in those moist clay conditions. And then there's others that will do better in drier soils. Just a real quick example, drier soils, dry to mesic soils, you think butterfly milkweed. And if you have wetter or more clay soils, you're going to use swamp milkweed. And then there's common milkweed, which will grow just about anywhere. But yeah, just sort of paying attention to that. And if you have question about, which plant species do well in the soils, when you talk to native plant nurseries, they can give you a really, provide you with good insight in terms of what plants will do better in different growing conditions.
I like that though. No fertilizing, less work, everyone.
Absolutely.
So early in your presentation, you showed a slide with that had a beautiful orange bug with white and black flowers on it. Can you identify that?
Beautiful orange, white and black. There's that, if I say it right, the Atalatus moth that is white and orange with some black outlines, and it may have been on a yellow flower. Is that? Let's see if we
It
can go
says
back
with
there
white
really
and
quick.
black flowers. I think I'm not sure it was.
Let's see if I go all the way, try and go all the way back to the beginning of the presentation. It may have been. Let's see if I can flip. I don't
Chris, do you
get anyone
want to
dizzy.
type? Chris
Um,
was the one that asked the question. Do you want to put more clarification in the Q&A for us?
let's see back here. Oh, sorry.
Let's see, beautiful orange bug with white and black flowers. I kind of thought it was in the
At the very beginning.
very
following
beginning.
the-
That was my impression. But I might be
collage.
wrong.
Let's see.
She says, Chris, I'm sorry, I don't know, maybe you're not a, I keep calling you a her, but maybe you're a he. Sorry, I think it was on a white flower.
A white
said.
flower. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's go forward. Here. Not one of these. So I think
Beautiful orange bug.
beautiful orange bug. We'll look. Maybe after the presentation,
Yeah.
I can go back and look.
Okay, but
Um,
while you're going through those slides, would you
Yeah.
just revisit that slide about how much the population of these pollinators has declined in the last decade? That is shocking.
Sure. It is. Yeah.
I mean, the last decade. So, I mean, if we aren't
Incredible.
serious about doing this on our own property and trying to encourage others to do it, where are we going to be in a decade? Is it going to, you know what I mean? If we've lost 50% in one decade and another decade, are we going to be at zero?
It's very concerning. It's very concerning, especially, I mean, when you think about the impact to any other group of wildlife species, as well as to our health and planetary health and climate stabilization,
Mhm.
regulation. I mean, everything is so truly interrelated. And, as a wise person said, it's like, you can't, wise people you can't pull up cogs of the wheel and not expect the whole thing to collapse. And it was a very unfortunate oversight, I think, in the past, of not realizing that which isn't seen, how much impact that has.
Right, it's shocking.
There's a great illustration of a person driving a car with a windshield, and it was like, I don't know, 1980 or 60s or something like that. And there's all these bugs all over the windshield. They're trying to clean it. And then present day, it's like, we don't have that now. You don't have to stop every so many miles when you're driving down the country road now to wash your
Mhm.
windshield off like we did not that long ago.
I know, and young people don't know when you're a little bit over 30 like me, then you remember a time when there was a lot of bugs outside, but not anymore.
Right.
We have a question here. Do you have any insights on the status of the native and pollinator garden registry within the city of Chicago? And do any of the suburban communities in Chicagoland have similar registries for residents? Are you familiar with anything about that?
I am not familiar with that. I know Chicago Wilderness does a lot of work that's similar to that. And the Field Museum also has some active registries, but I am not super familiar with that. There was once the million, and I believe it's still going, the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. But that's more of a national effort where people can get online and they can register their gardens.
Mhm.
But it's great to do that, because then we get a good idea of, where we have habitat, who's providing habitat, and then maybe where habitat is absent. So we know, as an organization or as a larger community, where we may need to bring resources. And in some underserved communities, that's really lacking. And there's a bit of work, for example, in the Calumet region that's conducted by the Wetlands Initiative, for example, or Great Lakes Audubon, to bring floral resources in and to plant gardens, both for pollinators and wildlife species, as well as for the people and the children, so that they have those resources to enjoy and to learn from and to experience.
So Janine would like to know more about using water or milk bottles for growing milkweeds.
Sure. So if you can envision, you're creating like a terrarium, so to speak, out of your container. And you're just adapting a water bottle by, see if I can get my hands on the screen, you're cutting it off about 3/4 of the way and filling it with soil. You're laying your seeds, you're covering your seeds, and you're watering them. And then you tape the top back on, but you just want to leave that the top cap, I should say, keep the cap off so air can circulate and water, natural precipitation can get in. And then you leave it up next to the house. I don't think it matters if it's the south side or the north side, but just somewhere so it doesn't, blow away or get lost in the yard. It helps keep seed predators out, birds and other rodents from eating your seed. And so it's in this nice little, terrarium protective environment. And then come spring, you'll see this, when you get the sprouts, you can just open the bottle back up, cut the bottle back open, and take out those seeds and act as plugs and plant them in your garden.
That's great. I love the word seed predators. I had a cardinal party in my yard after I planted some native seeds one year. My whole entire bed was obliterated, and I loved them.
Did they invite you?
Well, I was attracted by their chirping, but I was not very happy when I looked out the window. Oh dear.
I think a lot of us can relate to what Amanda asked here. My neighbors use mosquito chemicals with their lawn care. Should I be concerned planting plants to attract pollinators next to this yard?
Right, it is a concern. My neighbors.
You must live near me, Amanda, because I got them too.
Yeah, yeah, my neighbors do too. When that happens, it's sad, and it can be frustrating. Even the towns and the villages up here, they're doing mosquito abatement over the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, and I don't know what we can do, but I don't think in any way you're creating a sink by providing habitat and then your neighbor is spraying. If anything, your neighbor probably doesn't have beautiful native gardens. So if you do have native gardens with floral resources, you're going to attract pollinators and other beneficial insects to your yard. They will, probably not be, habitating in her yard. And that's, you're providing refuge for when sprays are used. And I don't know, I wish I knew of a way to control the drift, but I don't think that's possible when it comes to the mosquito spray.
And I would say, please, everybody, consider going on our website, contact us through the contact form on our website, and get involved in our ambassador program, so we can kind of like all work together to try to get the word out about some of these practices and how we can convince quickly others to stop some of these things.
Well, and I think that's part of it. When you're planting along with what Amanda's talking about, is if you have a beautiful garden in your yard, it creates an opportunity for those conversations to have with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
For sure. So Mary Beth says, so do I understand that I can lazily put native seeds out? Like she can just throw them out?
in the ground in the fall and then expect the plants in the spring?
I wouldn't say lazily. You can have fun, you can go out and you can broadcast. Again, one of the most important things for establishment and for the success of that seeding is good seed to soil contact. If you're spreading seeds in the fall, you want to like roll over them. You want to compact them or tamp them down into the ground to make sure there's good contact, if not being planted. The smaller the seed, the more shallow it wants to be planted. And some seeds, Culver's root, for example, Castrum, it needs to be laid on the soil surface. That's the beautiful thing about frost seeding. If you can spread your seed during, on top of a blanket of snow, then yes, you can lazily spread the seed. If there's not going to be more snowfall in the next few days, know that birds will come and eat some of the seed. But once that next snow layer comes and covers it, those will all be blanketed in there, and they will, again, as the snow melts, they'll work their way down into the soil right where they need to be.
Elizabeth, this was fantastic. So much wonderful information to help us. I mean, that is just so new to me, being out there spreading seeds with the snow. And this was wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And I just want to remind everybody, go to pollinator.org. As Elizabeth said, there's a lot of resources on the website to help us all know how and make it a little bit easier to add some native plants to our landscapes.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely.
All righty. Good night, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Happy planting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.